Good evening, all. I'm going to give it just a minute for people to come in and then we'll get started tonight. As you trickle in here, you should see a welcome poll launch. We'll do another one at the very end. This is just a very brief little poll that you should be able to answer and then click out of. And as I've got 4:01 Mountain Time on my clock, we'll start to slowly get the ball rolling. My name is Tal Kitron. I'm an elite tutor and executive function coach with Approved Tutoring, and I've been with the company for a bit over 10 years now, I guess over 11 years at this point. And as we are entering full SAT and, of course, PSAT season, we're going to talk a bit today just about PSAT strategy and things to know in advance of either a practice PSAT or the real PSAT, which many of you will take probably in a couple weeks. That's cool. We're scheduled for 90 minutes today. I'll speak for a little bit over an hour and then leave it open for questions. So we have a lot of attendees, but as you have questions, put them in the Q&A and I will get to as many of those as I can. My understanding is that because these presentations are recorded, registrants will get emailed a copy of the recording of the presentation. Generally, that happens at the end of the week, right? So I'm sure that's a question I'll get. Yes, it's being recorded. And yes, if you've registered for this, it should be sent out, I think, at the end of the week. All right, here's what we're covering today. Again, my name's Tal. Any questions that come up, just put them in the Q&A. We'll get to those at the end. So we'll talk about the structure of the PSAT and then the significance. What is it? Why is it important or not important for many people? We're going to look at the content of the verbal sections, modules 1 and 2, and some strategies that can help. So this is stuff that I would give in like a tutoring session. And I'll just I'm not going to hide the ball at all. I'll give you guys as much as I can. Feel free to take notes. Like I said, ask questions, but we're going to try to cover a lot today and get you feeling like you know what to expect on this test. That's my goal. We'll look at the content of the 2 math sections, strategies you can employ there, including the Desmos calculator that is built into the PSAT and SAT. And then just techniques throughout that you can apply, like I said, to a practice or real PSAT. Here's the scoring. If you've ever taken or been exposed to an SAT, you'll see that it's almost identical. You get 400 points just for showing up, but the perfect score that is a 1600 on SAT is actually a 1520 on PSAT. So perfect PSAT score is a 760 on math and a 760 on verbal. I don't know why they say it's the same scoring scale. So like if you missed, a question, you're probably 1 off of perfect. You're probably losing 10 points, but it is strange because the SAT is 800, 800. Other than that, it's identical to PSAT, but the PSAT is scored out of 1520. Like the SAT, the PSAT is an adaptive test, which we have a slide about in a second, meaning that the first module you see, which is always verbal, will kind of be a set form. So everyone's going to see like the same thing with maybe some questions moved around, right, for test security. Based on how you perform on module 1, module 2 will either be tougher or easier. So it only adapts one of 2 ways. We want it to be tougher because then you have a higher scoring bracket. Again, I'll talk about this more in a second. The same is true for the 3rd section, set form of math, 22 questions, 35 minutes. And based on how you do, the last math module will either be the upper or the lower level, and we want it to be the upper level. So here's again what this means. It is not question adaptive. It's not going to change from question to question based on how you do. So if you miss like 3 questions in a row, it's not just all going to be easier. And if you get 10 questions in a row correct, it's not going to all of a sudden get harder. Based on how you perform on modules 1 and 3 respectively, modules 2 and 4 will vary. And again, it will either be the lower level module or the upper level. If we are finding things to be super easy on module 2 or module 4 of the PSAT, that's not a great sign. right? It's always fun. It's like, oh, I'm nailing this. What that probably means is you missed enough questions on the first section to get into the lower bracket. So even if you nail every single part of section 2, probably can't score much higher than like a 570 or so. Whereas if you make it to the upper level and you miss most of module 2, your floor is still probably about a 600. You can't do much worse than that if you get into the upper level module. What this boils down to is that modules 1 and 3 are the most important part of the test. That's true for SAT and PSAT. Pretty much everything I say will apply today to SAT as well. Earlier questions count more. If you miss a few questions on module 1, that will count a lot more than a few questions on module 2 upper level. So really the goal is be perfect on modules 1 and 3, and then you have a bit more leeway to miss questions on the upper level and still get a fantastic score. Remember, these tests are graded on a curve, right? So a lot of people just don't think about that, but that's how they're standardized. And so it's not that you have to be perfect, you have to get as many points as you can, right? And that's scored compared to everyone else in your state for PSAT. So, I mean, what is this test? And we'll talk about why it's important or why it's not important for many of us. 4 sections, as I mentioned, reading and writing at first, and those are both 32 minutes for 27 questions. The most common time and pacing struggle that people have will be on module 2 upper level. So that second verbal section, just hard to get to everything. We'll talk about strategies, how to skip around and do it. For math, it's 35 minutes for 22 questions, and then same thing for module 4. This is 100-ish questions in just over 2 hours. And so that is much shorter than the old PSAT, which was like 3 hours, and just much shorter than older versions of SAT, PSAT, and ACT. So that's nice. We get more time per question, including breaks. We're there for about 2 hours, 15 minutes. So even with extended time, if you've got time and a half, it's not overly burdensome because we're there for like 3.5 hours, not 5. But for most of us, it'll be just over 2 hours and just under 100 questions. This note about pre-test questions, don't dwell on this. It's what we call experimental questions. We can't really know where they are. We can't really adjust our strategy based on that, but 2 questions per section won't count. We don't know where they're going to be. They won't be like at the beginning or the end, but 2 questions for every section are just like experimental to gather data for future tests. Again, we can't really adjust our strategy based on that. This is just for your knowledge. So like if you find module 2 super easy, we know, oh crap, maybe I'm in the lower level. Like I said, 2 hours, 24 minutes. That includes our 10-minute break right in the middle. So you do modules 1, 2, and then 10-minute break, and then modules 3 and 4. And just a whole lot more time per question than in historic versions of this test. Will there still be timing issues? Yes. Is it still definitely a time crunch for a lot of people? Sure, but much less so than it was even just a couple years ago. And then I don't want people to kind of put too much emphasis or not enough emphasis on the PSAT, because for more than 99% of students, so like most people attending today, if you're a student, PSAT scores, like in the long run, in the grand scheme of things, I have to admit they do not matter. The top 0.5% really of students in each state are eligible for national merit recognition. That is only for the junior year PSAT. So I know I'll get a question. If I did super well on the PSAT in 9th grade or 10th grade, can I use that for national merit? The answer is no. Only junior year scores count. And again, only like the tip top scorers in every state can get this recognition. National merit is a competition where you'll get a semifinalist status or a commendation. If you become a semifinalist, then you can become a finalist with an application and a confirming SAT score. The end result is like $2,500 scholarship, which is great, and a nice resume feather in the cap. It can set you apart a little bit at elite colleges when you're applying. But I really would say that, like, for example, I was a national merit scholar, got a good PSAT score, got my scholarship, but got much more scholarship money, and many more college admissions based on my SAT score. That's where the PSAT is important. It's a practice SAT, right? The PSAT is the same as the SAT in almost every instance. And it's just good preparation to kind of show you where you're at. There are some high schools that use PSAT scores in like 9th and 10th grade even for AP placement, right? Or something else. So if your school does that, sure, it's important. But I found that to be few and far between. Now, if you are in this tip top high scoring, or like you feel like, yeah, national merit is something I could maybe reach for, right? If you know, let's say you already have a good baseline PSAT score, you're a good test taker, you've put some practice in, or you have time to do so before the test. In that instance, and I'll have another slide about this, the selection index is what determines national merit eligibility. The selection index of the PSAT is found by taking the first 2 digits of your verbal score, doubling it, and then adding it to the first 2 digits of the math score. Verbal counts double for national merit. So like, let's say you're a really high scorer and you don't know what to do to prepare, verbal is just like twice as important. To get national merit, you pretty much need to be perfect on verbal or very close to it. This is what I mean by calculating it. A perfect score is 228. Above 220 is good enough for national merit in most states, but like a state like Washington is, for example, much more competitive than Alabama or Mississippi, where the eligibility and the scores for qualifying are lower, usually most years. If you get a 720 on verbal and a 700 on math, that's a 1420. It's a good score. And the way you calculate your index would be 72, so 10% of the verbal, you take away that 0, 72 times 2, and then plus the 70 from the math. Interestingly, you could get a better score and get a 1440, but if you do 700 on verbal and 740 on math, you can see because you're doing the 70 doubled plus 74, it's the same selection index. So if you do get a 1440 on PSAT, we would much prefer that to be reversed and have it be 740 verbal, 700 math. This is pretty confusing, so I assume we'll probably have some questions about it later, but the short and skinny of it is, for most of us, the PSAT scores don't matter. For super high scoring juniors, the 11th grade PSAT that you'll probably take in a couple weeks can get you eligibility for the national merit scholarship competition. And verbal is more important than math. Rest of today is mostly dedicated to content and strategies. We're going to spend a lot of time on like Desmos tricks and how to do math, but we're going to start with the verbal because that's what the PSAT begins with. So these are some strategies that apply throughout. I guess we didn't talk about this that like definitively, but the PSAT, much like the SAT, is all on the computer. So when I say active reading, that used to mean, all right, we've got our test booklet, we've got our Scantron sheet, we've got our pencil. And so active reading is underline, circle, star, make little notations, right? Take notes. Versus passive reading, which is kind of like start here, no pencil in hand. Often that goes here, and then we're there, and then we're kind of sunk. So active reading on the digital PSAT, which is taken via the Blue Book app. So if you don't have that, you can download it, but many of us will already have it on our computer from like prior PSATs. The way to do this on digital tests is there's a highlighter tool. I will say the other thing which you see in the third box here is the answer eliminator is probably more important. So for verbal, I would always have the answer eliminator engaged. We'll look at what that looks like. And just making sure that you're not just picking answers you like, but thinking like a test writer, crossing out answers that they put in intentionally to be wrong. So always actively engaging, right? Because it's easy to kind of lose focus, especially on like module 2 in the middle. And then one other really important strategy that you need to know is there's no points off for wrong answers. So never leave anything blank. There is no guessing penalty. A wrong answer and a blank answer count the same. If you don't know, or if, let's say, you run out of time, which is inevitable for a lot of us, I put the answer choice C here, but it really could be any answer choice. But my recommendation is, let's say you've got 5 questions left and you're out of time. I would go straight down the line, B, 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 or C, 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 or D, 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 because you're likely to get at least 1 or 2 of those correct, mathematically, strategically, probability-wise. If you Christmas tree it, like a lot of people want to do, A, B, C, D, C, B, A, we're probably going to miss them all. So just test taking strategy-wise, if you just have a few left and you run out of time, not the end of the world, but just guess straight down the line unless you have a compelling reason not to. So verbal, reading and writing, sections 1 and 2. 32 minutes for 27 questions. The average time is a little bit over a minute per question, but not all questions are created equal. Past PSATs, even just a few years ago, were 4 passages with 10 questions each. Now it's just short passages, no more than 1 question per short passage. So we're spending less time with everything. And you can see that on the left-hand side. This is an example. We'll also look at how this looks in the actual Blue Book app in a second. It may be true that there's a minute 10 per question, but certain questions like vocab and grammar might take us 10, 20 seconds, whereas a longer graph question might take us 2 minutes. Here's what you will see when you start a test. So let's get our bearings. On the top, you've got the time that starts to tick down. I have some students who hide it, but most do not. On the left side, you've got the question. On the right side, you've got the choices. And so the other tools to be aware of would be the mark for review button. So if you ever have a question, you're like, gosh, I'm just not getting it, I'm taking too long, you click mark for review, it'll turn dark red. And then if you hit the black button on the bottom of the screen where it says question 1 of 27, that'll open up a little window to all the questions and show you what you have left, what you've answered, what you haven't answered, and any that you've marked for review. So that's just an easy tool to navigate. And then the big one on verbal is the ABC with a slash through it. So on that top right there, to the right of mark for review, you always want to click that and have it engaged because it just lets you cross out answers. And generally on verbal, our job is think like the test writers, find the 3 bad answers, and you're left with the one that has to be correct. But this is the platform, all digital, usually going to be taking it on your own device or like a school provided computer. This is where if you are taking notes or if you're really like kind of thinking, all right, I need to get with it and kind of lock in on PSAT, SAT prep, this is the really important stuff from here on out. And this is a window into, for example, like what a tutoring program could look like, right? So like what I do is I live in Colorado now after many years in Atlanta. So all my students are remote and we just do, 90-minute sessions via Zoom, working on tests, practice test results, working from the book, but talking really about what is this test and how do you game the system and think like the test writers. And a big part of that is just knowing where you're at. Questions 1 through 4, we're always going to start with vocab. So the first few questions are vocab. You don't have to start with those, but most people will. And then very important, the middle of each verbal module, 5 through about 15, are the longer comprehension questions. And we'll look at some practice and what those appear as. But really, you got to get to number 16 with time to spare. So if you're finding yourself taking practice tests and running out of time, especially on module 2 upper level, maybe we do the first 4 or the first 8 and then jump to 16. Do not go in order, get to 16 through 27 earlier because they're much, much quicker. With practice, they're the easiest questions. And again, it's just important. We don't want to run out of time or confidence or momentum on the stuff that's easy to, the points that are easy to grab. So like 16 to 21, you just got to refresh your memory on punctuation rules, semicolons, colons. We'll do a little bit of that today even. Independent, dependent clauses, subject verb agreement, possession rules, and then misplaced modifier, they don't really test much more than that. So very much a finite amount of stuff. Then the next few are generally connector questions. However, therefore, just picking logical connections, which most people are pretty good at. And then the last few are bullet point questions, which they've started to be a little bit tougher, but we'll see today that the strategy for those is actually quite simple. So the big takeaway from this slide is know where you are, know that the middle is generally more involved and tougher, and do not feel compelled to go in order or answer every question perfectly. It is better to miss a question in 10 seconds than to get it right in 3 minutes. And that is really hard to come to grips with. Anyone with perfectionist tendencies at all could struggle on the PSAT and standardized tests because of this, just knowing like it's hard to embrace the fact that it's not a typical test where you've got to get everything right. Right? Grab the easy points, and a lot of those are at the end of the verbal modules. Here is an example of a vocab question. Same boilerplate language on the question itself. Which choice completes the text with the most logical and precise word or phrase? We don't need to read that on test day because we know that that's always what the vocab questions do. Strategy for vocab. Step 1, read the passage and predict your own word or phrase without looking at the answers. Read the passage on the left and predict your own word or phrase without using the choices. So here, frustrated with the blank of existing terms, this author coined a new term, clearly going to be a negative word. So I know then, I'm looking at the answers, which words do not mean something negative. Variety is a positive word. Precision is a positive word. So then we're down to B and D. We plug them both in. We kind of look at just which one makes sense. We analyze word roots if we have to. Limitations, I know that word, it seems to work, right? The terms have limitations, so this person coined a new term. Obscurity means kind of like hard to access. Sometimes it's obscure because it's just old or not many people know about it, like an obscure fact. I don't think these terms are obscure, so D is not a terrible answer, but B would be better and correct. And that's all we can do. We say no, no, maybe, maybe, plug in, pick one, move on. That's the SAT and PSAT. So these will always be what you see very much the first thing on PSAT test day. You're going to see this. If you can't predict a word, you may want to do just like a smiley or frowny face. Maybe you'll know that it's positive or negative, and maybe that's good enough. On verbal, you will always see multiple choice. So it's always A, B, C, D. There are no like free response or like writing anything on verbal of the PSAT. So all multiple choice. And so like, yes, we just get it down to 2. We pick an answer. If you got it wrong, it's not going to tell you, right? You're just going to keep going. The best you can ever feel at the end of a verbal module is, geez, that was pretty hard. I'm not sure how I did. I think I caught the tricks. If I have a student who finishes and feels like piece of cake, easy, that's never a good sign, right? Because what that means is we probably missed some of the little tricks that they play. But here we pick an answer. If we get it right, yay. If we get it wrong, oh well. Nothing else really changes on test day. But if you miss, let's say like 7 out of 27, that might be enough to throw you in the lower level. Right? So got to get at least, I would say, at least 17 correct out of the first 27 to be in the upper level. And that's just, you can't really think about that. We just try to do as well as we can, especially on the first section. So strategy, again, mask the answer choices, read the little passage and predict if you can. Eliminate answers that don't match. If you see like 4 words you just don't know, skip it. You're probably not going to get it. Right? A very high level PSAT practice strategy would be go through vocab flashcards, but it's only for the really tip top scorers. Hopefully we have 2 choices left, sometimes more, sometimes only 1. Plug them in, analyze context, and then pick an answer and move on. That's vocab. That's questions 1 through 4-ish always. Then we're in the middle. So when you see questions like this, we know, oh gosh, we're in the middle part. Some people like this stuff. A lot of people really do not. This is a command of evidence question, obviously here, not a graph-based one, but we will have those too. For these, your job is read the question first, and then the passage, and then eliminate. This one's a very hard question. It's based on a 1600s poem, so the language in the answers is kind of tough. But like our job here is which quotation effectively illustrates the claim? Well, what's the claim? The spring is a poem. In the poem, the speaker compares the changes in the season to the attitude of his beloved, which means we need an answer that has a comparison, and it's talking about changes in the season and comparing those to some person's attitude, a person he loves. If we went down the list and eliminated, I would say B and C are the two worst answers here. Both choice B and C talk about the changes in the season and nature, but neither of them have any indication that we're comparing to a person and an attitude. A and D both have the personal pronoun her, but I think A is just the earth has lost her snow white robes, makes it just sound like we're saying the earth doesn't have snow anymore, so the land no longer is white. D, very poetic, very old language, but saying even though the sun is very hot, it's not melting her, a person's heart. It's not making her less cold. So I don't understand everything in it, but we don't have to. We can still pick D fairly confidently because we've got the comparison and we've got a person as well as seasonal changes. So A not terrible, D better. Inference questions are the same process. We're not going to do this one, but this also falls in the 5 to 15 range. So strategy-wise, read the question, read the passage, eliminate. Think like test writers, these basement dwellers who write test questions all day, every day. They write a question, they write a correct answer, and then 3 choices literally meant to fool people like us. So if we can find the bad words and the ways they were trying to fool us, then we'll land on the best answer. And unlike on math, where you can prove it, on verbal, we're often just looking for the least wrong. So poke holes in answers you can argue with, end up with one that you can say, well, it is true. I can't argue with that. These will always have the language, which choice most logically completes the text. And even though it's an inference question, you should not have to infer a lot or assume anything. The strategy, again, for a longer question in the middle is question first, then the passage, predict if possible, but that's often too nebulous, too hard. Elimination, I would say, is the #1 thing on all of verbal. And then not a perfect answer, not a peacock, flashy answer choice. We like sparrow answers, small, unassuming choices that, it's true, I can't argue with it. So beware of very sweeping words like never, always, all, only. Those are words that are often wrong. We like words like may and some and could, because those are very gentle. Included in the middle portion is graph command of evidence questions. Some people really like these. They've done a lot of data interpretation. Others really dread them. Either way, you're going to do question, passage, and then the choices. So you don't really look at the graph first. Sometimes 3 answers will just be false and only 1 will be true in the graph. That's easy. More often, especially on module 2, everything will be true and only 1 answer will be relevant to the passage, in which case this would be a hard question that would take a bit longer. But these also come in the middle of the verbal modules. Now here's what comes at the end. It looks like a lot of info, but this would be the very last few questions. And these are, for a lot of people, can and should be the simplest. First rule on bullet point questions is 4 out of 5 times you can ignore the bullets completely. So I'll say that again. On these rhetoric, AKA bullet point questions, where you've got a question and these bullet point information pieces, 4 out of 5 times, you can ignore the bullets completely. For example, here, our job is introduce the research of Aubrey and Schmidt. Well, A doesn't introduce any research, and D doesn't even mention them either. So just looking at the answers without even seeing the left-hand side, I know A and D are wrong because that doesn't introduce these people's research. And then we're supposed to do it to an audience already familiar with global warming. I mean, B says global warming continues to be a major concern. Well, anyone familiar already knows that. And then these doctors are planning a strategy to combat it using volcanoes. That doesn't really introduce the research very well. So I hope it's choice C, which introduces them first. It says what they're doing, and it mentions global warming as if we already know what it is. Never ever looked over here. And like I said, you often will not need to. The times you will need the bullets is if multiple answers do what the student wants to do. Then you can look at the bullets to see which one's actually true. There might be just something that's false in there. But this is what I mean by you got to get here with time to spare. You do not want this question to be very much at the end when you're running out of time, because then you might miss it and there's no reason to. This is much easier than a question like this. So like on test day, if time is ever an issue, which it is for most of us, we could skip this question and a few others in the middle to get to these. Very much the right strategy. And again, for these, it's read the question. What does the student want to do? Test the choices and eliminate ones that don't answer the question or prompt, like the ones that didn't introduce research there we threw out. And if multiple remain, that's when you look to the bullet points to see which choice is actually true. But I would say, again, that's not that often, just a couple questions per test where you actually have to look at the bullets. All right, home stretch for verbal. So the grammar questions, including clauses. If you are in a crash course for PSAT or SAT, this would be one of two things that I would focus on: punctuation rules and how to attack these questions. And I mean, here's the rule, the dead giveaway, the strategy. Always go in this order. So for grammar questions, you want to go straight to the choices. Our eyes go to the passage, but you don't want to read that yet. Go straight to the answers to look at them and say, all right, what's changing? What are these test writers testing? And here you can see like A and B are a semicolon and a period, which are going to be the first that we're going to test because they have the easiest rules. And then C has nothing and D has a comma. Well, this question, if we know our rules, we can cross out A and B right away. On the PSAT and SAT, periods and semicolons are identical with one exception. And the exception is if like there's 5 other semicolons in the passage and it's separating items in a list with semicolons for some reason, they do that. But almost always, periods and semicolons are the same. They have to separate 2 full sentences. So without even looking at the passage, I know that A and B are wrong because they're identical and we can't have 2 right answers. So that's easy. I mean, that's nice. We're gone from a 25% shot to 50-50 at worst. I don't see colons or dashes, so then I'm going to go to C to see if we can get away with no pause. And this is where you got to trust your ear, right? You can't read out loud on test day, but you can mutter it or kind of try to hear it in your mind. She also dedicated herself to mycology, the study of fungi producing more than 350 paintings of the fungal species. So that didn't sound horrible, but fungi producing is not one idea. So the hope is if you read D with a nice long pause in the middle of those 2 words, she dedicated herself to mycology, the study of fungi, producing more than 350 paintings. That should sound better. But again, these I would say are the hardest questions on verbal for a lot of people and the most common and therefore the most important. The answer here is D. We can't have a period or semicolon because the second clause is dependent, but that's why we need a comma. And commas are the hardest rules to test, so we test them last. So your eyes here would just go straight to the periods and semicolons and test them first. Just a little more formalized table with some of those rules. Notice the rules for the second 2 being much easier than the rules for commas. So here, notice the middle bar, 2 independent clauses, 2 full sentences. That's an easy rule. You can look and just see, is this a full sentence before and after? If so, it's grammatically correct. If not, it's wrong. And then the colon is the other thing on this slide I want to emphasize, because on this test, it is often correct. The test writers know that we hesitate to use colons for anything other than lists. But the rule is you have to have a full sentence before. I had one great passion in life, full sentence. And the colon is a drum roll, please. It's an introduction. I had one great passion in life, drum roll, please. What is that passion? Making pizzas. So just don't shy away from colons, and definitely before the PSAT, review the rules to make sure you have a good sense of when I should use a period, a semicolon, a dash, a colon versus a comma. Connector questions are the only other thing we haven't talked about yet. And these are also at the end, 22 to 24-ish. The way to do these is look before and after and just decide, are these ideas contrasting or similar? And then eliminate answers. Here, organisms have evolved a number of surprising adaptations to ensure their survival in adverse conditions. Tadpole shrimp embryos blank can pause development for over 10 years. So that is an example of the first sentence. So B is a good answer. A shows contrast, so does C, both out. And then consequently is a therefore, as I wrote on the right-hand side, thus, hence, accordingly, as such. Those are all cause-effect words. And then on the other end, however and nevertheless are the same. So if you see both of those in answers, they're both wrong as well. And so again, these are ones you want to get to early to make sure you have plenty of time, because I won't say they're always easy, but they're definitely quicker than a long, involved command of evidence or inference question. So strategy for any grammar or connectors starting around question 16 of modules 1 and 2 is go straight to the choices. Figure out, what are they testing? Is it pronouns? Is it grammar? Is it clauses? Is it verbs? Again, test the easiest choices first. So whatever you feel like you can rule out or confirm, eliminate, and then trust your ear. Pick the choice that fits best. That's all we can do. And so just a recap on verbal strategy, modules 1 and 2 both look like this. Module 1 questions are more important than module 2 questions, because you have to get a certain amount right on module 1 to make it into the upper level module 2. But a question like 17, even though it might be easier, is not worth less or more than a question like number 7. So within a module, all questions are worth the same, which is why you want to go jump to the easy stuff, which is later. So some people even start on 16 and start with that stuff. I would do some of the longer, tougher questions early, right? Maybe knock out, especially on upper level module 2, the first 7 or 8. And then I would jump to grammar at 16. So I'm finishing in the middle with the longest and hardest questions. Both modules 1 and 2 are 27 questions in 32 minutes. A recap of your strategy for each question type. For vocab, I would mask the answers and predict your own word, eliminate answers, and then plug in and analyze as needed. For the longer questions, they're all kind of the same strategy. Read the question, of course, read the passage to figure out what we have, and then again, eliminate. Eliminate is the biggest thing on verbal. For grammar, we go straight to the answers, figure out what's going on, what are they testing. Again, elimination. And then for those bullet point questions, we don't often need the bullet points, but if there's multiple good answers, then consult them. That's it for verbal. I've seen a few good questions come in, and I'll answer those at the end. But just knowing that based on how you do on module 1, module 2 will be easier or harder, and we want it to be harder. Right? That's the long and short of it. And the way you can maintain your confidence and your time and your momentum and mental stamina is by jumping to the easier stuff on the early side. Right, so rest your brain in the middle of the section, go do some grammar, and then come back to the harder and longer questions. All right, let's talk math. Doing pretty well on time. So I'll talk about math for probably 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time to answer questions. The recurring question is, will the recording be sent out? Which, as I mentioned earlier, yes, the recording of these presentations gets sent out to registrants generally at the end of the week. But yes, the recording gets sent out. Math format, 35 minutes, 22 questions, giving us about a minute and a half per question. But again, not all questions are created equal. The old SAT, PSAT was a lot of word problems, very much a reading test, while it's now more of a pure math test. A lot of people like that. And then just remembering throughout, we'll talk about like the built-in calculator, which is hugely important, but then the geometry formulas, just know that they exist. They are provided. So if you see like a root 3 or a root 2, hey, maybe they're testing these special right triangles, right? If you need a formula for a pyramid, that's provided. So just knowing that it's there. What does the blue book look like? It looks like this for math. And that reference sheet that I mentioned is that little X squared on the top right. Other than that, it's the same as verbal. You can see the top has the time ticking down. You can see the answer eliminator, which is less helpful for math. Mark for review. And then the biggest thing will be that calculator button, which we'll look at in a second. Before we do, I've had a couple questions about multiple choice versus free response. Of the 22 math questions, 18 of them will be multiple choice on each section, but 4 of them will be grid-ins, free response. They're scattered throughout, so there's usually a couple kind of in the middle and a couple at the end of each section. And they provide these last 4 bullet points. They show you this on test day, but you don't want to waste your time. You want to know this going in. So here's what it really is what is acceptable, what is not. Do not round. 0.6666 is not the same as 0.66, right? Or 0.67. You have up to 5 spaces, so use them all. It's why I prefer to do fractions if you can. So instead of 3.5, I might grid in 7/2. Just got to be careful with rounding mostly and mixed numbers, but just knowing that like any of these 0.67 feels like you got it right, but that's not good enough. So don't round off prematurely. And again, only 4 out of 22 questions are grid-ins. I guess what's tough is, since there are no points off for wrong answers, you want to have an answer for everything, but it is hard to guess on a free response question out of all the numbers in the world. Whereas if you guess on multiple choice, you're 1 out of 4 shot. So just another thing to be aware of if you're running out of time, that could influence your strategy. But again, most of these are multiple choice. And so we kind of have our tools like isolating, substituting, scratch papers provided on both verbal and math. So you want to be showing your work, but you also want to be taking advantage of the tools that are provided. And this is the big one. When you click that calculator icon, which I would have engaged pretty much always on this math section, here's what it pulls up. It's a Desmos graphing calculator. It does everything that like on desmos.com graphing it would do. There's also an option to toggle to a scientific calculator, but you can also bring your own. But like, I can't emphasize enough how much this can do. And we'll look at some practice questions, but we can't even scrape the surface today. I mean, this makes easy questions easier and some really hard questions very easy as well. 60 to 70% of the SAT math can be done via Desmos. So we still need our own kind of understanding and logic and math tools, but most questions can be answered with this little calculator on that top right. Click it, you see the small version, expand it, you see the big version. The only annoying part about the big version is that it covers the answers. So you have to kind of slide it around. So going into Blue Book and getting some practice with that is probably a good idea. So again, we'll talk a lot about this for the math. Like this is a big focus of the rest of the day. As I said, it can remain open through the whole test. You just click it open. There's no, you can use it on both sections 3 and 4. There used to be a no calculator section that doesn't exist anymore. So you have your own handheld calculator. If you want it, sure, bring it. But this can do everything that can do and more. Very convenient because you see the question, the answer, then you've got your little solving calculator right there on the screen. And this is, they've done a really good job with PSAT and SAT. Like I wouldn't say it's immaculate, but the Blue Book platform and the way you can do the calculator stuff is pretty intuitive. It's very much like not rocket science. So just got to get practice and get comfortable with it. So what can we do with Desmos and how do we get fluent with it? Sometimes we want a solution to a system. Well, that just means put them in Desmos, see where they cross. That's the solution. That way we're not flipping a negative sign or mixing up X and Y or making careless errors or wasting time doing math. I feel almost fraudulent as a tutor sometimes these days because I want to teach you the factoring method and how to do it. But in reality, the faster and better way is just how do we use Desmos? So a lot of tutoring now has become, I think for a good tutor, has become using those tricks and showing you how do you know when to use Desmos and how on certain questions, right? And when not to use it. Here's the distribution of the math content. We're going to go into each category and just look at a few sample questions. Look at algebra. I mean, algebra and advanced math, that's algebras 1 and 2. 70% of PSAT math is algebra. A little bit of geometry and trig, a little bit of stats like mean, median, mode, line of best fit, probability stuff, percent. But most of this test is algebra. So if there's anything to master, it would be algebra and how to use Desmos to full advantage. Now, if you're looking for near perfect scores, you got to master the geometry, trig, and the stats too, which may be as simple as refreshing things you learned a couple of years ago, right? And just knocking off rust and seeing what types of questions they tend to test. The biggest drop from the old test to this is the stats. So they're not going to have many questions on those, which means the few they have might be pretty tricky. Got to make sure you know mean, median, mode, and the difference. And then percentages, I think, would be the other hardest thing because they can test it in a bunch of ways. Overall math strategy. Read the question, figure out what you're solving for. And then plan your attack. We don't have hours, right, or even minutes, but you can figure out, am I supposed to draw out an equation or two? Do I go to Desmos? Like, what's going on here? Is it a proportion? Every math teacher ever has probably said, show your work. Don't skip steps, do the calculations. And then, like, let's say you're solving for a degree measure and it looks like it's less than 90, but your answer is 170. You might then double check and think, wait a second, I must have missed something. So always do make sure you solve for the right thing, right? Maybe you got X, but they asked for 3X. So just double checking that you answered what the question's asking for. And I added this because I don't want people to just do Desmos. There are certain questions where you should just do the math. It's easier and preferable. Checklist to have in mind is the basic algebra, stuff you've done probably from day one of algebra 1. Isolating variables, combining like terms, factoring and foiling, which we almost never have to do on this test. And then just distributing or substituting, for example, an XY point. If you hit a wall and you're like, man, none of this is working, you could try using the answer choices. You got 4 choices for a reason. If the choices aren't very friendly, they're not like whole numbers, maybe you pick your own numbers, plug them in and try them. And then definitely don't forget about Desmos because, like I said, that's the passport to solving a majority of questions. So have the algebra thoughts and steps in mind, but really be thinking about, could I use Desmos to make this easy? So one strategy that is maybe less important now than it used to be because of Desmos is working backwards. Inequalities and least and not questions like this can give people pause. So here we've got which of the following values of X is not a solution of this inequality. Depending on the student, I mean, I'd probably tell most people just to do the math here. It's very simple math, -3 on both sides, -2x on both sides. Treating it like an equation because you can do that, and you're left with X is greater than or equal to -8. well, this is greater than, this is greater than, this is equal to, so this would be the one that doesn't work. But this is a question that you could put this inequality directly into Desmos. And maybe just try it later and you'll see how easy that becomes. Working backwards here would be plugging in a number just to see if it works, right? So like if you put in -5 for x, you would get -15 plus 3. But then here you would get -15, and -12 is greater than -15. We want something that doesn't work. And again, -9 is the one that doesn't. So a bunch of ways. Your job is to get to a comfort zone, find it. So like when you see this question, you know what you're doing to solve it reliably. Another strategy that I think is still important is picking numbers. So when the answers kind of look a little bit ugly like these, you may want to pick your own number. This question is the number of virions grown in a cell culture doubles every 12 hours. There's 100,000 to start. Which of these exponential models represents the number of virions V in the cell T days underlined after the start? These are ones where you could punch them into Desmos with X instead of T and kind of look at what's happening. Ideally, we look at this and see exponential growth and know that the first number has to be the 100,000. A and B don't get it right. And then the picking numbers part of this is, well, let's say it was 1 day. T is 1. In 1 day, we should be doubling twice. The choice that shows that is D, right? In 1 day, T is 1, the exponent becomes 2, and we double our 100,000 2 times. Whereas if you plug it into C, the problem with that is you get to the 1/12, which means in 1 day, it hasn't doubled yet. It would take 12 days to double 1 time. C says we double every 12 days. D says we double twice per day. This is something that you would just have to see a few times to like get used to what they're asking. It's not a hard question, but it, at first glance can look like, what the heck is this? Reviewing the main content areas for math once more, and we'll look at some practice questions, then just some Desmos tricks, and we're pretty much done today. So home stretch. Starting with basic algebra. So what we've got here, I was just glancing at some of the questions that have come in. And I'll get to those at the end. So while I'll say for basic algebra, which is 35% of the test, a lot of y equals mx plus b. Stuff you've done. Every single person here has done that at some point. Maybe it's been long enough that we are rusty, or maybe the teacher wasn't amazing. But mx plus b is something to really get back into before PSAT, because you will get tested on it a lot. That's systems of 2 lines, which is always a Desmos question, linear inequalities, and then just stuff about slope and intercept. So just not mixing up x and y. Here's a couple of examples in that vein that I would consider pretty easy questions, especially the first one. Leave this up for just a minute. So the truth is, the left-hand side is a Desmos question or simple math. My hope would be that most people would just start by distributing on the left and on the right. You get 12x minus 21 on the left, and we get that that equals 12x plus 20. Now, if you graph these in Desmos as expression 1 and 2, you would get two lines that have the same slope, but different y-intercepts. You could continue algebraically, set them equal, and get negative 21 equals 20, which where I come from is not true. But the hope is if you see 12x and 12x on both sides, you can say, oh, those are parallel lines, they never intersect. The answer is 0. If you put it in Desmos and saw that two parallel lines like that, that would be an easy way to prove it. On the right-hand side, we're asked for the interpretation of y, which is attached to the 1800. So it has to be the residence and not the industrial. And then the question is it the average number or the total number? And we're just looking for y. Well, the equation itself is modeling the total number. So that means 1800y is the total number in the residence. Y must just then be the average. That is a vestige of the older PSAT, which is a pretty wordy modeling question. But modeling both exponential, quadratic, and here basic linear modeling still does get tested. You can expect to see questions like this kind of a lot. And if you're ever stuck, like plug in numbers, if you plug in like y is 0 and y is 1 and y is 2, you could probably tell that it wouldn't be the total. Next category is advanced math, which like I said is also algebra, just more like algebra 2. Also close to 35%. This is harder for some, but some people have seen it more recently in school, so they prefer it. This is ax squared plus bx plus c. So knowing the forms, vertex form, intercept form. Someone asked, what is factoring and foiling? This is what factoring and foiling relates to, right? Like if you have an x squared plus 5x minus 14, used to be they would have to like factor this. And then from that, you can find, this is probably a blast from the past from a lot of us, but from that, we can find the zeros, the x-intercepts, x equals -7 and +2. The nice thing now on SAT is if you put that straight into Desmos, it will give you a parabola with a 0 at -7 and a 0 at 2. So you can just click on that and then kind of know everything you need to about that particular equation. X-intercepts, zeros, solutions are all just different names for the same thing. But when they say solutions on these questions, they don't mean intersection points. They usually mean x-intercepts. Solutions are values of x that make y 0 when dealing with quadratics. And here there are just a few things you got to memorize, like the quadratic equation, quadratic formula. Got to know little things about like factors and intercepts and how they relate, minimums and maximums of polynomials and what that means is in terms of vertex. So these will be some of the hardest questions, but then a lot of them are going to be like, oh my gosh, I can just use Desmos, or as soon as you review your Algebra 2 stuff, you're golden. This is, though, I would say also more common on SAT because a lot of PSAT juniors haven't taken all of Algebra 2 yet. So I wouldn't expect the super duper advanced questions that you'll see on SAT to necessarily come up on PSAT. Here's a couple examples. So if we're looking at 3n equals 7m over 3k minus 2, there's a lot of variables. This is one that I would say kind of like, man, I don't know if Desmos is the right option because there's just too much going on, right? When I've got x's and y's straight into the calculator, but here, all the answers are just isolating 3k minus 2. So you would multiply both sides by the denominator. I can just show that work here, it's right here. And then the denominator on the right side would cancel. On the left side, we're left with 3k minus 2 times 3n. That's where you fight the urge to distribute because all the answers just have this by itself. Our last job is just divide both sides by 3n and you'll end up with d. So that's 2 steps, multiplying by the denominator to get rid of the fraction and then dividing the remaining variable. The second question is most important probably because it's like the heart of SAT algebra, and it might remind you of physics or calculus if you've taken that, but it's easier than that. They've given you this equation, which if you graphed it on Desmos would look like that. And the question is, which value represents the height from which the ball was dropped? Well, when the ball is dropped, t is 0. It's been 0 seconds since it was dropped. And if you either plug that into Desmos or just see 0 here, 0 here, well, h of 0 will just be 600. That's your y-intercept. That would not always be your maximum point. Like if you're throwing a ball, then the starting point is not the maximum. But in this case, we're dropping it. So that would be the maximum. That'd be the vertex. Then 2 more categories and then just some Desmos tricks and we're done today. Stats, which includes actual statistic stuff, but mostly unit conversion, ratios, percent, and then some probability and mean, median, range stuff. A lot of people have not taken a stats class, but kind of have some background knowledge of a lot of these things. Even though it's the least common math topic, it is where I see a lot of my high scoring students missing most of their math points. So it is worth review and practice. And I'll show you at the end some ways to do that, like some tools to use for review. Here's a couple examples. There are many, many ways to do the first one. My preferred way is maybe a little bit of overkill, but I still would do it this way. I would go to Desmos, open up my calculator on the top right. I would type in exactly this. No commas. Desmos doesn't like commas. But I would type in 1248000 equals X percent. They'll give you the word of if you just type the percent sign, and then 160000. It will give you a straight line, which is an X equals vertical line, which will be your answer. And of course, like here, we could also do the math itself. So like if I wanted to say, okay, well, it's 1.248 million out of 1.6 million, you could just divide those two numbers and get 0.78. The answer is C. For question 2, the hope is that people kind of see, oh, this is a simple one, and I can just look and see that data set S and data set T are the same, except for this number. If data set S has a small outlier, well, that would mean that the average would be smaller. This is also a question that you should not have to do on Desmos because of the relationship there, but if you type in the word mean and then the numbers with commas in between, this is where we do use commas. If you did this into Desmos, literally you type the word mean and then these numbers, it will give you the average. Percents and mean and median, it's scraping the surface of the stuff Desmos can do for you to make your life easy. As a tutor, I feel like that's my job, is help my students make their life easier, find the path of least resistance and the reliable, simple way to solve on every question. And if we can use the calculator, you're darn right we're going to. Right, so this is, I would say, 2 kind of simple-ish data analysis examples, but people get freaked out with percent and with mean, median, mode, and they feel like, man, I don't remember. And then last and kind of least is geometry and trig. I've already seen a couple questions about what kind of this stuff do they test. Well, lines, angles, triangles, got to know your basics. Perimeter, area, and volume, which they do provide the area and volume formulas. SOHCAHTOA, so sine, cosine, tangent, they'll test that a couple times, but not often. The more common thing would be right triangles, but they give you Pythagoras, they give you special right triangles. You just got to remember that those are things that exist. I've had a couple questions about showing work. So, I mean, you're getting scratch paper, but nobody's ever going to see that. Even in the old days where you were writing the test booklet, you don't get points or points off for work shown. It's just good math practice, right? So like for geometry, it's probably the most important to use paper. right? If they don't tell you or show you the shape, you got to draw it out to see what you're dealing with. But you're not going to get points off for not showing work. It's just you're probably going to make a careless error here and there, right? Or maybe you're relying too much on mental math, which you get no points for. But no, nobody's ever going to look at your scratch paper. The only thing you submit for PSAT is each section. When you're done, you just hit, end, and then they'll see the multiple choice answers. That's it. Here are two geometry and trig examples. Definitely a couple of the trickiest questions we've seen so far. So I'll leave those up for just a minute. So the first question on the left, I think a lot of people will get stuck. People have muddled things in their head about geometry, but the first thing would definitely be draw out the triangle and label the sides we know. So that's 52, 48, and 4 root B. And then people have like trigonometry in their mind, but this is definitely not a sine, cosine, tangent question. They didn't say any of those trig identities, so we don't need them. We just need to figure out 4 root B is the same as like the hypotenuse. So this is one where I use Pythagoras. We could say 48 squared plus 52 squared. And if you really want to get fancy, you could then say like equals 4 root x squared and find the answer. I might just do this and find the actual number. So like, let's say we were doing the math here, just why not? 48 squared plus 52 squared is a big number. It's 5,008. That means this is the same as root 5,008. And again, there's a way to do this in Desmos. You could also say, well, 4 is root 16. So if I divide both sides by 4, I'm really dividing that by root 16. And 5,008 divided by 16 is 313 would be your answer. This question's tough. I would definitely get to the point where I have 4 root B as the hypotenuse, and then with practice, you should know how to use Desmos to get this without any math, honestly. And we'll look in a few slides about how to do that with Desmos and kind of what it looks like, but I'd practice on your own for sure. On the right side, we are dealing with alternate interior, alternate exterior. That means that y and z are the same, but z plus x and y plus x are both 180. So we won't do this question right now, but even if you just look at choice z or angle z, it's clearly more than 90 degrees, right? It says it's not to scale, but like it's not going to be A or B. So just kind of using logic, still helpful. But one thing I want to make sure we look at just a bit more definitively, and we'll leave probably 10, 15 minutes for questions, is Desmos. Creating tables is something I've recently kind of figured out. It makes a lot of questions super simple. You can practice at desmos.com, go to the graphing calculator, but we're just going to look at how to make some of these questions second nature and incredibly easy. This is what I mean by feeling fraudulent as a tutor sometimes, because on the ACT or 3 years ago on the PSAT, I would have said, all right, we got to do the math. We got to isolate X and then substitute, or we got to use elimination. We got to get rid of X completely. But now the reality is you do not want to do that. The only risk you run is flipping a sign. A system of equations and a solution is where they cross. So it's stupidly easy now. You're going to type, all you have to know is literally on test day, type in these two equations to the provided calculator, zoom out or in as needed, click on the intersection point, which will show up, and then determine, are we solving for X or Y? In this case, they want Y. The value of Y is 3. Done. And even if you did the math, you'd probably get it right, most of us, but maybe we take a minute instead of 10 seconds. And then we have less time for harder questions later. So systems of equations, it's just where they cross, just graph them. Easy as can be. This one would be a way harder question if we did math. So the function 2x squared plus x minus 21 has zeros, aka x-intercepts, at points A and B in an xy coordinate plane. What is the length of that line segment AB? In other words, what is the distance between the two x-intercepts? Well, all I need is a picture. And a lot of people like at this point are like, oh man, I didn't realize I could do that on Desmos. You could do so much more than this, but this tells you everything. I mean, not only does it tell you that the distance between these 2 points is 6.5, right? Making that your answer, C. If you needed the factored form, we could get it from this. It'd be x minus 3, and then this would be a little bit different. If we needed the minimum, the vertex, you would zoom out, you would click on the vertex. So it's silly how much this can help us, but you really got to know it to game the system. Here's an interesting one because it's not 2x squared, it's 2x cubed. This is another one where it's just ridiculous because I used to say like, well, let's plug in some points and just by hand see which ones work. But now we're just going to graph it. I actually, instead of typing the word table, what I would do on Desmos, and you can practice this, is type in the original, and then there's a little gear button that pops up right above. So like right around here, a little settings button. If you click that, then you can hit, then a table option comes up, and then it'll give you all the points you need. And if you want a new point, if you want to know like what is y when x is 5, you just type in 5 and it'll show you. But here, if you do that, it's going to be a very simple way to solve because we can see, okay, -1, 5, that's a point. So going back for a second, -1, 5 is in A and B, not C and D. So C and D are wrong. And then the other thing that's different between A and B is when x is 2, looks like y should be 14 or 10. And here it says 14. So our answer to this question is B, because that has the one that matches all the points. There are other ways to do that, but always make it simple if you can. If you were to test the answers, you would type these into their own tables, and you can actually just then do a quadratic regression. It's ridiculous. It'll just show you the equation. So yeah, that's just one thing, one of many things you can do with Desmos. And then I believe this is the last question. I'll leave it up for a minute to see if people would have the right system that they could draw out. The key is if you have the correct system, then we're into Desmos. So here we've got a budget of 100,000. That's going to be one of our inequalities with the 230 and the 640 prices. The other one's going to be like an x plus y is less than or equal to, or sorry, greater than or equal to 150. Right, so the minimum of 150 tablets is tablets plus laptops total has to be bigger than 150. The other one though is 230 per tablet plus 640 per laptop can't be more than $100,000. Those are your two inequalities. And then at that point, Desmos, right? And I think I messed up the first inequality, honestly. It's been a long Monday because it's not saying x plus y, it's saying a minimum of 150 tablets. So it would just be x is greater than 150. That's my fault. But if you see on the next slide, that's the two inequalities we have. You're going to get two shaded regions that intersect at 150, that's the tablets, comma 102.344. So to be in this range without going over it, we cannot exceed 102. Our answer is 102 because, oops, that's the maximum amount of laptops we can get because 102.3 laptops would not be very helpful. One of the trickier ones we've seen, especially because inequalities freaks people out, but we can make it very simple if we've got the two correct inequalities. So to recap for math, and I've got some good questions coming in, so we'll get to those soon. Always answer what the question's asking. Pay attention to detail, so know what you're solving for, right? Don't skip steps and don't leave anything blank. For English, there's a definite way to skip around. For math, maybe less so. I would say it gets harder as it goes. So like the first 10 questions, even on upper level math, will be easy. Like sometimes alarmingly so. You're like, geez, is that it? But then you should see around question 15 on upper level math module 4. I would say 15 through 22 are going to be tough. So jump around there and grab the easy points for you. And the last few questions on module 3 will also be tricky. You can bring your calculator, scratch papers provided. Don't forget there's usually a simple solution and it's often via Desmos. So how to practice, a question that's already been coming up a bit. Appleruth, my company, has 4 fully digital adaptive SAT mock tests, which can be taken as PSATs because they're basically the same. So there's PS23A and PS23B, for example. The nice thing about those is that it gives you really good feedback on what questions you missed and what types of questions they are. So like in my first tutoring session with a student, we'll often go over the first mock test and just look at questions they missed to see, why, how can we fix that? College Board has 7 digital SATs and 2 digital PSAT 10s. The junior year National Merit PSAT is the PSAT 10/NMSQT. So the 10th grade PSAT and the 11th grade one are pretty much the same. Any earlier tests like 9th or 8th grade PSATs are usually slightly simpler. There's less advanced material. So each year the material becomes more advanced. But those 7 Blue Book tests are great. And they also provide answer explanations and a nice platform to show like what you missed. So I would definitely be doing those if you're aiming for a super high PSAT or SAT score. I would try to get all those tests done. All right, let's open it up for questions. I'm going to launch one more poll. There we go. And if you are satisfied, don't have any questions, obviously feel free to take off. Thank you for joining. But I have seen a bunch of good ones come in. This number is on the next slide as well. But if you are interested in tutoring, you can request to work with me, although my schedule's kind of full at the moment, but maybe down the road if you're like a sophomore or early in junior year. We also offer academic prep if you're struggling with a certain topic or AP exam or whatever in school. And then EF coaching is more recent, but that's more for helping students plan, prioritize, and organize. So like a test prep would be 90-minute sessions once per week. EF coaching is more like 30-minute sessions. You want to spread it out as much as you can. All right, question time. I've seen a bunch of good ones come in, so I'm going to start from the top. First question is, well, anyone who asked, will there be a recording of the session sent to our emails? Missed when I said it a couple of times. Yes, these recordings get sent out at the end of the week. So if you registered, yes, you'll get the recording. So let me dismiss those. If I do test prep for the SAT, does that prepare me for the PSAT? Yeah. Test prep for the PSAT is test prep for the SAT. It used to be the PSAT was just a shorter version, but now they're like the same. The only difference is maybe the very advanced vocab and poetry stuff on the SAT and the very advanced algebra too might not show up on PSAT. But yeah, if you're prepping for SAT, you're doing your job of preparing for PSAT and then some. Good. Let's see. Someone asked me to go back to a slide, so I'm going to do that real quick. So the first one is the student-produced response strategy. So I'm just going to leave that for a moment. Question about strategy on reading, which I think is one of the important takeaways today. So the question is, just to make sure I understood, you are saying we should do some of the longer comprehension questions first, and then go to the grammar parentheses for a break, and then go back. Yes, I think that's, for most students, the perfect strategy. do the first 8. So 4 vocab, 4 long questions. But then especially in module 2, a lot of people will start and be like, my God, I don't know what I'm reading. Those are 2 tough questions in a row. Give your mind a break and jump to the grammar, finish out the section, and then yes, come back and finish with like 9 to 15. That's exactly what I mean. Yep, good call. Next question is about math. Do we just put a fraction for anything that isn't a whole number? Ideally, yes. There's a bit of nuance with rounding that we couldn't get into today. But yes, there's a fraction button on Desmos that can simplify fractions for you. Don't round. So either the decimal to like the 4th, the thousandths digit, as long as you can bubble in, or a fraction if it's appropriate, yes. Let's see what else. If I open the Desmos calculator during the test, am I still able to see my questions and answer them without closing the calculator? Yes. Especially the small version. If you expand it to the bigger version, it does cover the answers. So you have to slide it to the bottom of the screen. But yeah, you can have it open all the time. A couple questions about math and geometry. I would say the hardest geometry gets is 3D volume, and stuff about like slant height of a pyramid is really hard, as well as surface area with 3D shapes. The other thing they don't really do unit circle, but there's some special right triangles and a bit of radians to degrees once in a while. I think that would be more likely on SAT than PSAT. And so the other question that's related is, if I'm in geometry right now, would the math be harder since I haven't taken Algebra 2? Maybe. I do think even for PSAT, Algebra 2 is very helpful to review some stuff. More so SAT, but I do think there'll be some Algebra 2 on the PSAT. They'll be tough. And it depends on the teacher and the school. Like maybe you've covered that in Algebra 1, or maybe you haven't seen vertex form and parabola stuff yet, which I do think they will test us on. Very good questions. I'm going to a different slide because this is the other one they asked for. So just some multiple choice strategies. Okay, so that one's good. Good questions. I'm going to get to at least a dozen or so more. So next question is, if Desmos does not like commas, how would we list numbers? Yeah, good question. The only time you would list numbers would be like for that mean or median example where you have in parentheses, and then you do use commas. So if you're separating numbers in a list, you do, but if you're writing 1,000, don't put a comma after the 1. Next, how is this PSAT test different from the test given in 8th grade for the child for magnet school admission? So that is what I meant by like some schools use the early PSATs for placement in AP programs or in schools or magnet admission. I think the test generally given for those would be the SSAT. And that SSAT is an anachronistic test that's like analogies and really hard and just like very all over the place. All paper. So this PSAT test is really different. PSAT is SAT. The SSAT is like the test from when I was a kid, decades ago. And so, yeah, I would say if you're thinking SSAT, which is for admissions to some lab schools or magnet schools, this is pretty different. Let's see. Next question is it better to self-study and practice more or get a tutor if my first SAT score is a 1430? I mean, a first SAT score of a 1430, so 700s in both verbal and math is fantastic. I think it depends on the person. If you work well with a tutor and you just want to kind of look at the most advanced stuff, like obviously we can help with that. But tutoring is expensive, and it's also a matter of really effort. So no matter whether you're doing it on your own or with a tutor, are you putting in the individual effort? I provide mostly like guidance and saying, here's what we should work on, and here's how to explain the hardest questions. But yeah, I mean, you could probably use a few hours of tutoring. You don't need a ton, but also looking at those blue book tests and just trying to find the hardest questions. So it depends on the person and a lot of other stuff. On the SAT and PSAT, do incorrect questions bring down your grades or no? They do not. On the SAT, there are no points off for wrong answers. On the PSAT, there are no points off for wrong answers. That's another difference with the SSAT. Let's see, a couple others. Will questions 15 to 22 on upper level module 4 be worth more or less than 1 through 15 on module 3? No. So like, that's actually an interesting question. All the questions on module 3 are worth more than all the questions on module 4. No question on module 4 is worth more than any other question on module 4. So I guess 15 to 22 on module 2 will be worth much less than 1 through 15 on module 1. Much, much, much less than. You could miss all 7 at the end of module 4 and get like a 7/5, like a very high score. Whereas if you miss 7 out of the first 15 on module 1, not going to go well. All right. Got a few more minutes, so let's see if I can find a couple of the good ones. Will 9th grade take the same PSAT as 10th grade? No, which is why if you go into Blue Book, you'll see a PSAT 9, which is the 9th grade version, and the PSAT 10 NMSQT, which is the 10th, 11th grade version. 9th grade version is a little bit more simple because there's material you haven't covered yet. Yeah, a couple other questions. How is the taking the PSAT in 9th grade useful? What are the benefits of taking PSAT in 9th grade other than getting experience? It's mostly the experience. It's that formal test taking environment. If your school doesn't count it for anything, which most do not, it's not going to go to colleges. It's not going to affect your SAT score. It's just practice. So it's really getting that formal testing environment like practice in. That's really all the benefit is. Yes, you can bring any calculator pretty much. So TI-84 plus CE is good. The only ones they don't allow are some of like the CAS ones that are literally internet connected computers, but you can pretty much bring any calculator because Desmos can do pretty much anything a calculator can do. All right, 2 more questions. One is, are there any downsides to taking the SAT several times? Very few. There are like 5 colleges or universities, count them on one hand, very elite schools that require you to send every test score from every SAT sitting. But vast majority of colleges will only look at the scores you send or super score and see your highest section scores. So no, if you take it 5 times, you're probably reaching the point of diminishing returns, but it takes most students 3 official SATs to reach full potential. And I recommend taking at least 2 or 3. All right, last question is a good one here. A lot of great questions, so I'm very sorry I couldn't get to everything. Do feel free to email info@appleearth.com with any other questions. Like I said, this recording will get sent out. Let's go with the last question as a combination of what would be a good PSAT score and then how should I prepare. The first question is almost unanswerable. So when someone asks me what's a good SAT or PSAT score, it just depends on where you start. I would say probably national 50th percentile average these days is probably about a 10, 20, maybe. But most students that we work with will start at like 11 something and want to get up to 13, 1400s. Those are the competitive scores for a lot of like the Big 10 or SEC schools, just like 1400 plus these days. As for practice, I mean, Appleearth does have a really good book. You can get that without tutoring. But individually, the best way to practice is practice tests, review questions that you've missed and treasure them. Khan Academy is pretty good too, but I would stick with Blue Book at first and the Appleearth PSATs, and then really with a fine-tooth comb, look at what am I missing and why? If I saw this again next time, how could I get it right? All right, again, thank you for all the good questions. Thank you so much for joining. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and good luck with PSAT and everything down the road. Have a great night.